Okay, so this little video is all about the synoptic content that you might include, some of which you must include, into Unit 6 coaching. This synoptic content actually relates to Unit 5 applied research methods. So, single course, you don't actually study this unit. Double course, you do. And importantly, some of the stuff that you can incorporate from this unit is actually stuff that we may have mentioned already. We've just got to give some language and terminology to it. So remember that some of this knowledge could come into 6.1, 2 or 3, but we're particularly looking at making sure we integrate some of this content into 6.2 and 6.3. So naturally, this research methods content may apply to sort of two aspects of your coaching. One is collecting data from your participants. Now in 6.2 there's a section on measures, tests, ways that you assess, and we will talk about the quality and the things to be mindful of about when you select tests and how much you rely upon or how credible the results from some of those tests are. The other thing is how you treat your participants. So when you're doing research, you have to treat your participants in a certain way which is fair and ethical and safe. And obviously when you coach, similarly, you must treat we've talked in 6.1 about treating your participants fairly, with respect, and you yourself acting professionally, being courteous and polite, etc., etc. So those are the two ways in which research methods content may be related. How you treat your participants, what you do with their information, keeping them safe emotionally, physically, and measures, collecting data. How can you collect credible, good, valid or reliable data versus something which is a bit more iffy, which is a bit more maybe subjective. So let's have a look at the sorts of topics that I think you can incorporate. I'm going to talk through these, as I said, in sort of two parts, ethics and data. So I've separated it here: ethics, data collection, measures and safety, and then the types of data or the types of tests you might use. So let's kind of get into it. So specifically in terms of ethics, these are the sorts of things that you could relate conversation to. Certainly in 6.3 you may not have, and probably you didn't, in fact you won't have, said that you will gain informed consent from your participants. You probably didn't do a PAR-Q, a physical activity readiness questionnaire. And those are two basics that if you're doing research you must complete. But as a coach, if you're being paid to take children or adults for a series of 10 sessions, at the start of that what you should do is have a document that they sign, or a parent signs if they're under 18, to give consent for them to take part, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. So we'll look a little bit about safety, the physical safety aspects, the emotional well-being and sort of emotional safety, mental health safety, how we treat data on the people you're working with, and of course how you should act, and that relates to 6.1 qualities. So if I change research to coach ethics, that will be more applicable to you, of course. So I've grabbed some of these from my research methods materials. So what is ethics? Ethics is a lot to do with fairness, honesty, what's right and wrong. We talk about ethical making products, don't we, nowadays, so that we're not harming anything else, not harming animals, not harming the environment. That's right. That's treating and valuing those aspects. So ethics is all about how you treat people, how what your values are, what your morals are, what is fair and right and wrong. Being, if something's wrong and on your conscience, it probably wasn't ethical. So it's the right thing to do, I guess. So as a coach, obviously there are some behaviours that you should do because they're the right way to be or the right thing to do. I talked about gaining informed consent. So this is often a written document. It's better to be a written document because it can be a legal document as well, and it should be signed. Basically, this is a document that explains what your players are going to do, your participants are going to do, what tests they might do, Are there any risks? So obviously some of you might work really intensely. Is there a possibility they might feel dizzy? Or if you're doing a combat sport, is there a possibility, whilst you are wearing protective equipment, that they might get harmed? You have to explain what might possibly happen to them, but also reassure them of the things that are in place, and your risk assessment will tie in with this as well. They need to understand what they're going to do and what will be required of them, and ultimately, once they understand this, they give full consent to take part. This is, I haven't changed all the wording, but this all talks about testing because it's based on research. Yours will be on your sessions, your training. It could be testing and measurement as well. They also have the right to stop taking part if they want to. That's their right. It's ethically right that if anybody gets, for any reason, doesn't want to carry on your coaching sessions, they can stop. And then, as I said, if the participant is under 18, you need parent or guardian or carer to sign for them, and you as the coach should also sign it, really. So it's like a permission. So I've said that this is an example of one that you might use in research, and yours might just be a paragraph that explains what you're going to do through your sessions and the sorts of content of it, the risks and benefits, what possibly might happen. You might feel a bit queasy if it's a really intense session, but actually the benefit will be this, that and the other. So it can be, especially if you're working privately and getting paid for it, can be really valuable to have informed consent. Then, before you started working with participants, you should do some kind of PARQ, physical activity readiness questionnaire, or medical screening. Especially if you're working with older people, you want to know if they've got any conditions that may put them seriously at risk. Actually, it's also a bit like at the start of your session asking about injuries. That's the sort of immediate thing. They may have completed this week 1, and then by week 3 they might have injured themselves. So it's always important to update and check these things. And there may be some occasions when, if you were a coach working with players and they said yes to any of these, that you say, actually, before you take part, I need you to have a check with your doctor to be sure, to be safe, that it's going to be okay to do these coaching sessions with me. So this is a medical screening. It's about their medical health and can be really important to do. Now, you're going to gather lots of information possibly on your participants, and if you didn't do this before your sessions, then, or your measures, then in your evaluation, what you can say is, actually, if I were going to do this series of sessions in future, I would make sure that on week 1, I got all my participants to complete this, because, and then give all the reasons why you should do it. So I'm pretty sure you didn't do it, but you can incorporate into your evaluation for future actions what you should do. You will be collecting data, and you may have heard of GDPR and your legal obligation not to disclose or share personal information without the consent of the people themselves. And there've been this all came about because there basically are leaks of data in big companies, and a lot of people's personal data's got spread or bought or sent or shared, and it makes everybody very vulnerable. Now, the personal data you have on your players or your participants might not be bank details, but it could be addresses, or it could be ages, it could be dates of birth, it could be sensitive information about background, it could be things like weight, which could be really sensitive for people. And it's your legal and ethical obligation to protect that information, to use your integrity to make sure that we keep data stored in a secure location. So you shouldn't talk about people's information without their consent. You shouldn't share it. You shouldn't really post it publicly unless you have consent. There is a law, as I said, so Data Protection Act 2018 is the most recent one I found of this. Protects people and provides rules about how data can or can't be shared or used. So, as I've said, you may have sexual orientation information, you may have health status information, and it's really important that you keep this private and confidential. Now, how do you do that as a coach? things like you make sure that it's locked away somewhere. If you've got paper copies, you put it in a locked filing cabinet. If it's digital, you have it on a password protected file. And again, it's common sense. Don't be talking about somebody else's weight verbally. It's that just obvious ethical respect of people's information that you should do. So that accounts for sort of the data protection information stuff. Ethically, you are responsible, and we've talked in 6.1 about duty of care. Go back to 6.1, look at some of the stuff from that, because this is all relevant too. You have duty of care as a coach. You're there to make sure that your players are not physically or emotionally harmed. I've made you all do a risk assessment to account for that. You should, based on 6.1, know where the nearest first aider is and the nearest first aid is. It could be that your future recommendations for you as a coach would be to get a basic first aid qualification to increase that level of competency to deal with anybody who maybe does get injured. Did you ask if people had asthma inhalers? Again, future action. You may have put it in your risk assessment, but did you in your session? Because I know some of you haven't. Reflection for you. Did you if you were outside, did you change your activity based on there being a bit of drizzle or a bit slippery underground or hard underground? Did you have a contingency plan? What would you do if? And maybe you didn't, and maybe you in your future actions you say, actually, I should have gone into the sports hall because it was available. I had booked it for you, to anticipate that. Were there any times when your players were grouped too close together? Did you have too few, too many in a small space? What would you do if? Did you have in your session plan a contingency plan for what if somebody does hurt themselves or the alarm goes off? Do you know what you should do if you're responsible? So these are all ethical and legal factors that might be something you can incorporate as Unit 5 applied research methods. I have made you do a risk assessment, so that should be there already. And again, it's being aware of these emergency procedures. Okay, so that's most of the ethical stuff. This second part is going to focus on the data, the type of data and the collection of data, rather than the first bit was what do you do if you have data? How do you deal with these people as ethical beings? So you should know already from 6.2 that there is objective and subjective measures. Subjective being personal opinion on something. I'm going to judge you, but it's my own opinion. Objective is I'm going to get data on you, but it will be factual, neutral, not personal opinion information. And actually, if we just change the language, what we're talking about is two types of data. So the subjective data, personal opinion, is qualitative data. Subjective data was observational analysis, watching a performer, you giving your own opinion on what you think the coaching points were done well or not so well, giving them technical or tactical coaching points of how they can improve. That's just your opinion, and that is subjective. So the information you got on their qualitative quality of their performance was qualitative data. If you did an agility test or a speed test or something which gets you numerical data and it's objective, it's not about your own opinion, did they pass the line in 3 seconds or 5 seconds? Ooh, I think it was or it wasn't 5 or 3 seconds. That's objective data. And what we tend to call this is quantitative data, because most objective data is numerical and is about quantities, how fast, how far, people did, how high, how many did they score. That's quantitative data. So if you haven't already, you can talk about measures in 6.2 being quantitative or qualitative. If you did a standard field test that was an agility test or a vertical jump or a speed test, you gathered quantitative data and you analysed your performers quantitatively. If you talked about in 6.2 observational analysis, looking at coaching points and giving your opinion on how well they did, that's qualitative data. Okay. If you did notational analysis, noting down or tallying how many successful shots, passes, interceptions somebody did versus how many they missed. That's quantitative data. It's how many, it's numerical. Okay. Now, the issue with qualitative information is because it is subjective. You could have 3 coaches watch a performer and they could have different opinions on how well they performed. So for that reason, we would describe this way of measuring and analysing as being less valid, less reliable. I could watch you one day do stuff, I could watch you another day do the same stuff, and I could have different opinions. It's inconsistent. So validity is, does it measure what it says it's going to measure? And reliability is, if I repeatedly measure using this same test or this same way of measuring, will I get consistent results? So anything that's opinionated is always going to be a bit vulnerable to interpretation, a bit vulnerable to variation. And we would therefore describe these measures as being less valid and reliable. Doesn't mean to say they're bad. It just means they may not be consistent. Quantitative measures can be more valid and reliable, but not always perfectly so. Let's move on. The other thing that you could say is, as a coach, if in your series of sessions or in your session you coached or in 6.2 measures, you talk about using different ways of measuring your participants, then we might be talking about mixed methods or multiple methods. So if I wanted to measure agility and I did the Illinois agility test, and I wanted to do one which had skill in it, so I did the Illinois agility test or the T-test but with a basketball, both of those are quantitative measures and they measure the same thing. So that is multiple methods. Illinois agility is method 1. My coach devised skill-based fitness gathering time data, so they do a T-test but with a basketball. How fast do they do it? It's still quantitative but measuring the same thing. That's a multiple methods. What that gives me is more than one test information on how good they are at agility or agility with skills. I could do the same with qualitative. So if you use more than one qualitative or more than one quantitative test, that's multiple methods. Okay. This one is slightly different, mixed methods. What you're using in this way is a mixture of qualitative and quantitative. Now, I reckon many of you did do this. So in your sessions, what you do as a coach every session is you observe, you watch, and you judge. That's qualitative. All of you did that in the sessions I've seen so far. I reckon all of you, though, will also be saying that I'm also going to be doing some standard tests, field tests, or some coach-devised field tests, and gathering some numerical data. How fast did they do the Illinois? How high did they jump? How quickly did they do my field testing? How many did they score? Notational analysis. That is quantitative, which means that as a coach, you're gathering a variety of types of data to use in your analysis of your performance. Mixed methods. So all you're going to do is try to use this language to say, I did this because I used multiple methods to gather data because, or I used mixed methods. And the nice thing about mixed methods is you kind of get the best of both. You get the numerical, factual, more valid, more reliable data, but you also get that other more detailed information about why somebody might be performing well or not. If you think about notational analysis, it tells you how many they scored or how many they missed, but it doesn't tell you why, whereas the qualitative observational analysis might give you that information, but takes time, a bit slower to do. Now, this goes a little bit away, I suppose, from measurement and a little bit onto the training. It could be to do with the tests you use, actually, but it's a little bit more broader than just testing. This is what we call evidence-based practice, EBP. As a coach, what you should be doing is staying up to date with what's current, what's the guidance current. If you're working with your players and you're using certain coaching techniques or strategies or drills, is that based on evidence, or is it stuff you've made up? If you're doing any psychological strategies with them to try and reduce their arousal levels, let's say it's a breathing technique or a visualization technique, is that based on theoretical evidence, or is it you just making it up? Now, it's not to say that stuff that is not evidence-based is going to be wrong or bad, but there is a professionalism and a credibility that comes with being knowledgeable about the theory out there and applying it in your practice. So nutrition, are you advising your participants to consume this, that and the other based on research that has evidenced it being effective? If so, great, there's evidence for what you're recommending. A simple example, I guess, is this. In the old days, to improve your endurance for footballers, netballers, hockey players, it was about training low intensity or moderate intensity for ages, hours. So it was low intensity, high duration training. And then more recently, we've had HIIT training. So it's been about working highly intensely for a very short period of time, then having a short break and then doing it again. And we're talking seconds, not minutes or even minutes, certainly nowhere near hours. And so literature evidence has shown that doing HIIT training can be equally as effective as doing hours of submaximal training. So going back to this, if you're doing some HIIT training in any of your sessions to improve your participants' aerobic and anaerobic fitness, that's great because it's based on evidence. So if you can slip in some, justification of why you're doing it, or in your review that you're using evidence-based practice by doing HIIT training, then that is really relevant. Or dynamic stretching, it used to be just the static stretching, and then suddenly that was all wrong. And dynamic stretching was introduced because it's based on evidence that says that's better at mobilizing and preparing your muscles in the movement patterns rather than static. Static stretching can make your muscles less powerful for a short period of time after you do them. So doing that at the start of a session doesn't make sense. Okay, so this last chunk is more back to do with the tests and the way you choose, the tests you chose to do with your participants. In 6.1 we talked about lab tests. Now lab tests are highly valid, highly internally valid because they control a lot of the variables. However, they lack ecological validity. They're not particularly realistic. A footballer running on a treadmill isn't the same as a footballer running on an AstroTurf or on a field with boots on. So they lack that realism that field tests can have. So doing a yo-yo test, a yo-yo which is a standard field test, can be much more ecologically valid than a lab test, however, to measure aerobic capacity or VO2 max. However, what the lab test has is control, and it actually measures the gases. So it is more controlled. We don't have other variables like the wind, the sun, the weather, other people affecting the values, the scoring, the performance. But what we don't have is much realism. So it's kind of one is better in some ways, but the other is better in other ways. But you could talk about these types of validity. So validity is really, does the test measure what it's been designed to measure? Okay, does the test measure what it's designed to measure? And if it is, we would describe it as being highly valid. So sit and reach for a test of flexibility is okay as long as you're just talking about hamstring and hip flexibility. If you're talking about shoulder flexibility, it does not measure it. So you have to be quite specific with it. And how you do the tests and how much control you give to your protocol, your method, will influence how valid tests are. What we really want is gold standard test. The gold standard test for speed is 20-minute meters, 30-minute meters using light gates, or VO2 max is the treadmill or the bike in the lab with the gas mask on. It directly measures it. But we can't do that. The trouble with them is we can't always do those. So we have alternative field tests to do them anyway. And this literature says actually the Chester step test was okay. It was comparable to the gold test, the results. So one group of people did the gas analysis and then did the step test, and they got quite a good correlation. It was very similar, the results. So if you get an R value of 1, that means it's perfectly the same. If you get an R value of 0, it means it was nothing like the same. So anywhere sort of 6, 7 and above is a really good correlation or relationship, same sort of results. This literature says that the yo-yo test is a good correlation. So it was 0.65. So that's a good correlation between the yo-yo test and the proper gas analysis test. Again, which means you don't have to do the gas analysis test in a lab. You can do this and it's pretty similar results, which for coaches is perfect because there's loads of advantages to the yo-yo test. So our gold standard tests are always going to be preferable, but they're not always possible. I've mentioned already, and hopefully you recognise this term, ecological validity. How realistic are your tests? Doing the field tests versus doing the lab stuff. Doing the lab stuff versus doing something which is more realistic. What we want to do is have realism, but have truthful data. So if you can control variables as much as possible in your field tests, you might get the best of both worlds. Okay, so jumping ahead to the term reliability. Reliability is how consistent are your results. If I did one test or measure on you today and did it tomorrow or the next day or the day after, would I get similar results? And that means that the test is reliable. Now, reliability is a lot to do with controlling variables and the protocol, the method. And if you can do that, then you're more likely to get similar results. If you do get similar results, so I tested you today and I tested you a couple of days later and we got similar results, we would describe that test as having high test retest reliability. If I did the test on you one day and then we did it in different conditions, or I had a different distance between the cones, I hadn't measured it out on the second occasion, then, or you know what you're doing, and let's say it was a shooting test, you've practiced today, we did a test, and then I did it tomorrow, we can't be sure that the practice has affected you. So we would say that has lower test retest reliability. Now the trouble with subjective analysis, observational analysis, is it does vary person to person. So if I had to judge you and grade you on your skill or quality of your passing, your shooting, your intercepting, dodging, whatever it was, and somebody else had to do the same, a different observer or coach in this context, because it's subjective, we are vulnerable to giving different scores, and we would describe that observational analysis as having low inter-observer reliability. It's because it's subjective, it's vulnerable to different opinions basically, so low inter-observer reliability. Objective tests, objective measures tend to have high inter-observer reliability. And the way to have, these are just some ways really to get more consistent, more reliable. Make sure you know what you're doing with equipment. Have consistent conditions. So if you do the yo-yo test in the sports hall one day and you're going to measure them again, make sure you do it at the same time of day, same location, the same surface. If you're doing, let's say something like sit and reach, take multiple readings, take the average maybe. Make sure any equipment you use is calibrated. You know already if you have something like a stopwatch or a phone as a instead of timing gates, you have that human error type thing. So it's really important that you try as much as possible to have valid and reliable measures or tests. Last bit to incorporate then is the equipment you use to measure, and I've just mentioned human error. Where possible, technology can remove some aspect of subjectivity, so it does tend to make it more objective. This is not as ideal as this, but then again what you'll be saying is, in your work you can say, I know that this is ideal, but we don't have access to that, therefore we did this. But the problem with this is human error, reaction time is going to be different. You're just showing off that you're aware of these things. Some equipment, like scales, might need calibration. So if you do any measures where there's equipment that needs calibration, you're just checking that it's consistent and the same. Because what we want is accurate measures. We want truthful, accurate measures, and we want consistent measures. And just to really summarise, in order to try to optimise or maximise accuracy and precision, make sure equipment is calibrated. If you can get higher quality equipment, that's great. Make sure your testing environment is consistent. Have a standardised protocol. Make sure you give the same instructions. You treat every participant the same, and that they understand what they're doing, and try not to make any mistakes yourself. So you need to know what you're doing also. And here's just a summary of a lot of the things that I've mentioned. Okay, so just to finish, really, there's a lot of stuff there, forgive me. You'll need to go through, try and incorporate aspects of these in different parts of 6.2 and 6.3. 6.2, very much this is associated with the measures. The ethical stuff could be anywhere in 6.2, to be fair, how you treat people, particularly the competitive, maybe the isolated stuff. But measures, very much this relates to equipment you use to measure, choice of test, and also in 6.3 for very similar reasons. How you treat your participants, how you measure them, the measures, the balance between quantitative, qualitative, understanding and talking about the weaknesses and pros. You can talk about, I use this test, I am aware that it's not ideal, it's not as valid as this test, but because we didn't have it, I couldn't do that, or in future I would use that.